Many thanks to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. As one of the largest online naval computer games, you've probably already heard of World of Warships, but starting now until the end of January next year, they're going to be running the Holiday Convoy event, where you can get various rewards for playing that you can turn into various rare, epic, or legendary ships. Or you can hold on to those rewards in anticipation of the 4 brand new ships that are due to arrive this December. You can also acquire up to 18,000 doubloons to spend on other in-game items such as ships, captains, systems and more, and if you're new to the game then you can use the code IMPACTFORCE, which will help you on your progress through the game by offering you a series of further rewards. Now, if you manage to acquire enough event tokens, you can eventually get your hands on the Queen of Torpedoes, the Master of Torpedo Beats, the Japanese cruiser Kitakami herself, last seen making beta testers cry over a decade ago. And the last of the Iowa class, the mighty USS New Jersey, is also, finally, due to enter the game towards the end of the year, and you can get her with your event tokens. I will, of course, be aiming to get the New Jersey as a matter of priority. But whatever ships you happen to choose, have fun playing, try not to explode, and you might make me explode if you see me in-game. Now, speaking of exploding, as soon as people decided, hey, we're going to use explosives to fling projectiles at other ships for the purposes of sinking them, they found they faced a problem. Namely that, well, now their own ship was packed full of explosives, and a similar amount of return fire might cause those explosives to detonate rather catastrophically, which ran somewhat counter to the whole make the enemy die in a screaming fire objective. This was emphasised during the mid to late 1500s as ships began to convert from primarily boarding-based vessels with some gun armament to primarily gun-armed vessels which could also board. And there were a number of explosions aboard vessels in this period which occurred both in battle and outside of it. One of the more notable being the crippling of the galleon San Salvador during the Spanish Armada's progress up the Channel, which according to some reports was caused by a disgruntled and much-abused gunner who threw a slow match into an open barrel of gunpowder, setting off a chain of explosions and fires that crippled the galleon and left it to be captured by the English. It's quite notable that this is unlikely to have been a magazine explosion in the way that we understand it, since the galleon was crippled, particularly it was noted in its rigging, as opposed to being blown to splinters and sunk, this indicating that the explosion was most likely higher up in the ship, at least above the waterline, possibly on the gun deck, possibly on the upper deck. And so, rather rapidly, the concept of a ship's magazine was invented. The first step was simply moving the powder below the waterline. Close-range cannon exchanges mostly ended up with shot hitting above the waterline. Waterline hits themselves were quite rare, and generally speaking, most cannon in the Age of Sail had neither the depression nor the firepower to send cannonballs much below the waterline. And so a magazine positioned a couple of decks below the sea was perfectly safe from incoming fire. The next problem, though, was the crew. Gunpowder was notoriously sensitive, and any spark, whether it come from a lamp, a torch, or even from a hobnail boot striking something, had the potential to set off a ship-destroying explosion, especially since the powder was stored in barrels and then had to be decanted into powder bags for use in the guns, a process that inevitably led to some spillage, especially when the powder bags themselves may not necessarily be completely fully stitched, or stitched tight enough to keep the powder from coming out. And so a variety of safety processes were developed. The walls of the magazines were lined in copper plating, although lead was also used early on. The idea of this was that the material wouldn't spark if it came into contact with something that otherwise could generate sparks. And anything that could potentially generate sparks without hitting the walls, so anything that was made of iron, anything that was made of stone, because some kinds of stone such as flint could also strike sparks, and various other spark-generating materials, were completely banned from the magazines, and heavy curtains were installed to brush off any lingering embers or other ignition sources that might be on a crewman who'd just come down from the gun deck to acquire powder. Needless to say, any open sources of heat or flame like matches, pipes, and anything else that was actively smouldering was likewise banned from the magazines. Light, though, in the era before electricity, came from flame-powered light sources. This issue was solved by having said flame-powered light sources outside the magazine, casting their illumination into it through thick glass screens, very occasionally horn screens in the very early days, and this provided a way for the men inside the magazine to see, while also physically separating them from the flames, and therefore also separating the flames from the powder. Although it did mean that magazines could be fairly dark and dingy in some cases. And thus the pattern would be set for the next several centuries, with only really minor variations on the theme. Ammunition, being various kinds of solid metal or stone balls in various shapes and sizes, could of course be stored pretty much anywhere that was convenient, as it posed no particular fire or explosion risk if it took a hit. It was just the powder that was the problem. However, as the Age of Sail reached into its later stages, additional challenges began to appear. Ships got considerably larger, and this meant that distributing powder from a single magazine could leave the guns that were furthest from it rather short of powder in the middle of an action when they really needed it. And so smaller secondary magazines had to be developed for larger ships. On top of that, the slow development of the explosive shell began to present issues, as now the ammunition could also be a hazard if it was hit. Albeit admittedly not as much of a hazard as the exposed powder, but still potentially a problem. At first, this hazard was limited to bomb ships and other specialised vessels that used explosive shells in mortars, but the widespread use of the shell gun after the development of the Payhan gun in the early Pax Britannica period, as well as the Payhan shell, meant that explosive ammunition suddenly became considerably more common. The earliest solutions to this quandary were simple. Just keep the hollow shells empty, and then you could just have them lying around like most other ammunition, and you'd only bring up the powder needed to fill them just before you fired the round. For a bomb vessel with one or two slow-firing mortars, this was fine. But as more and faster-firing direct-fire shell guns appeared, this became completely impractical, and so adaptation was made based on provisions that had been put in place previously for things like when rockets had occasionally been held aboard ships, namely storing them in their own magazines below the waterline. This, of course, meant taking up more space down below, which meant it was in competition with room for general supplies, food and water, the medical facilities like the oil opdeck, and from the 1840s onwards, steam engines, as although steam power had been installed on some ships in the 1820s and 1830s, auxiliary steam power became far more widespread in the 1840s and onwards. Not only did the steam engine compete with the magazines for space, they also posed a whole new danger. As they used coal-fired boilers, there was now an additional set of potential flame sources, as well as more general heat sources, deep below the waterline. And so magazines not only had to be more carefully located, and in many cases isolated from the boiler room and the coal bunkers, but in still further cases they also had to be insulated, since the midship spaces of a ship were ideal for both the storage and distribution of ammunition, and the placement of heavy machinery. And so in many cases, even if isolated by a bulkhead, the magazines might actually be right alongside the machinery or the bunkers supplying it. Failure of the insulation could cause overheating of the magazines, and overheating of the magazines could in turn lead to explosions, so it was very important to get this right. The advent of armoured ships actually didn't change things all that much initially. Weapons were still very short range, the propellant was still gunpowder, although it was beginning to come in new and more exciting forms, and the vulnerabilities that ships faced were still pretty much the same, just on a larger scale. The only minor change was that as fewer and larger guns were mounted higher up, and ships also got larger, the chance of a down-angle shot deep into the ship grew ever so slightly, and so magazines joined the machinery as being the two primary parts of the ship outside of the guns themselves that absolutely needed to be held behind armour plating, if there was any. This combination of protection for the weapons, the armour and the machinery became known as the ship's citadel. For a brief period, the advent of turrets, that is in their original cylindrical form, caused a relocation of some magazines, as many turrets either sat pretty much at the waterline in the case of smaller ships like monitors, or in the case of larger ships like HMS Monarch, the turret's protection extended somewhat below the level where the guns themselves were based. This in turn seemed to afford an opportunity, as shells and their charges were also getting considerably heavier anyway because they were supplying bigger and bigger guns, and so if the ammunition could thus be stored right underneath the guns, then either passing it up to, or later hauling it up to, the guns on chains, would make things considerably faster and easier than having to traverse part of the length of the ship to get to the area where you needed to then go upwards. And the protection of either the turret's armour or the waterline belt, or both, would still be there to guard the magazines. This was, however, a relatively short-lived era. The increasing power of guns meant that the turret armour quickly began to be pulled up to cover just the gunhouse, i.e. where the guns themselves were, in order to make it thicker, and the race between guns and armour also meant that there was still a chance of a round penetrating any armour, turret, waterline belt, above waterline belt or otherwise, and then detonating in amongst the charges and the shells. The increasing size of the guns was also obviously linked with an increase in the size and weight of the ammunition, and so the magazines rather quickly moved back well below the waterline, with various powered mechanisms, usually known as hoists, used to move the ammunition up to the guns. At this stage, it was generally decided that the magazines for the storing of the propellant should be below the shell storage rooms. This two-layered approach saved on the length of the citadel rather than having one after the other, but it also had a practical purpose. Shells did have explosive in them, but they were generally far less sensitive than the propellant was to being hit by external forces, as we've already covered. And so in the event of a waterline penetration with a shell on a downward trajectory, it was thought better to keep the more dangerous explosives, i.e. the propellant, as far from the potential impact as possible, with the more inert shells acting in some ways as a bit of a last-ditch semi-protective barrier before the invention of the armoured deck. The other issue was that traditional turrets rotated, but nothing underneath them really did, and this meant that loading had to be done at fixed angles where the openings in the turret floor and the hoisting mechanisms could align. Of course, this also meant the magazines could afford to be somewhat off-centre relative to the turrets, since they didn't need to spin with the turrets, which was fairly good because early breech loaders tended to run all the way to the back of the turret for reloading, rather than having their breeches roughly in the middle, or, in the case of the Royal Navy, with it taking muzzle loading all the way through into the 1870s, the reloading mechanisms could sometimes be completely outside the turrets. On HMS Inflexible, this led to the rather odd situation of the magazines actually being positioned quite far forward and aft on the ship, with the ammunition then being moved between a third and half the length of the entire vessel, as well as a couple of decks up on a gentle slope, to the loading mechanisms, which were themselves a deck down and somewhat away from the guns. The guns would then have to rotate and depress to line up with the rammers, and the loading could take place in this fixed location. Due to the rather justified generational fear of powder fires, the lines of transportation were generally kept incredibly clean, and so at this point what we would now call flash protection was somewhat less of an issue. Now, of course, you did want hatches and such along the train of supply for watertight purposes and to block the spread of more general fires, but as long as everything was kept clean and tidy, even a minor spill of powder in an otherwise clean environment was not actually massively risky, especially considering that the explosives being delivered by incoming shells also tended to be powder-based, and thus the detonation was relatively, for explosives at least, short and sharp. But as the 19th century drew into its last couple of decades, advances in metallurgy and propellants began to accelerate. First with slower burning powder formulas, and then propellants moving on to nitrocellulose, aka gun cotton, and then both derivatives of this and in some cases closely related chemical formulas. The common theme amongst these new explosives was a longer burning period, which in turn allowed for longer barrels and thus allowing the shells to go faster since more energy was imparted to the shells over time, and similar advances in the nature of the explosives that were loaded into the shells were also made. But the propellant still remained the more volatile of the two, partly because the propellant, of course, didn't have to survive the massive acceleration of a shell, so it didn't need to be quite so inert, and partially because whatever explosive in the shell was placed in it was enclosed in a rather thick steel coating, which made it rather difficult to set off, whereas the propellant was present both in much greater quantities than the explosive present in the shell that it was going to fling downrange, and by this point the propellant was usually stored in silk or similar cloth bags, as opposed to several inches of steel. And of course, in the case of those who wanted to use sliding breech block guns, some of the charges, namely the last to be inserted, were in brass cases, although the forward charges would still be in silk bags, At least when you're talking about battleship scale weapons. When you get down to smaller cruiser scale weapons or secondary batteries, you can sometimes get entirely brass cartridges, but that's by the by. Now, of course, for safety as well as longevity, these charges, whatever they were held in, were then usually stored in some kind of sealed case. And this could be leather, cardboard, occasionally metal, and sometimes a mixture of all of these, or some of them, or some other kind of material. But essentially they were in a disposable case on top of the container for the actual propellant. But the new explosives led to a pair of related additional problems. Firstly, the explosions of the shells, and potentially the ignition of propellant charges if they were in the turrets at the time that a turret took a hit, could last for longer, again we're talking about explosions here, so that is a relative term, and result in flash, essentially a surge of extremely hot flame or hot gas that travelled outwards for some distance from the point of an explosion. This flash could then travel down the shell hoists and into the magazines, potentially setting off the magazines even if the hit was actually quite a long distance from the magazine. The other half of the problem was that, on paper, the new propellants were considerably more stable than gunpowder. Gunpowder seemed that it would just ignite if you so much as waved a heat source in its general direction, whereas the new propellants needed the heat source to be much closer and sometimes more sustained. In many cases, they also needed the heat source to be hotter than what you needed to set off gunpowder. And, at least in most testing, the new propellants seemed to burn energetically if you set them on fire, rather than explode. This would then, in turn, lead in some cases to a far more relaxed approach on both the storage of propellant and the cleanliness of magazines, as opposed to the centuries-long paranoia that had been associated with gunpowder and its derivatives. This relaxed approach could, at times, have fatal consequences. But the first factor, the different nature of the explosives when they actually went off, along with the increasing size of ships, as well as a few other safety concerns, would lead to much more extensive magazine and flash protection being integrated. Magazines gradually shifted to being separate rooms beneath and away from the barbette, which, with the new style turrets that had begun to emerge in the pre-dreadnought era, involved an armoured gun house that rotated, that sat atop a fixed barbette which didn't, but which also had a lot of structure attached to the rotating part of the gun house, which was then suspended inside the barbette. This actually made loading considerably easier, as the loading mechanisms could then be mounted on the turntable with the guns and fixed in position relative to the guns, and then both of them turning on that same platform. And then at the lower end of things, the hoists that led to the loading mechanisms would then have the charges and shells brought forward onto a lower rotating platform where they could be placed on the hoists and brought up. For passing charges from the magazines to the hoist area, scuttles gradually became standard. They'd been in place before on some ships, but would now gradually become the default. These allowed charges to be passed through a bulkhead, while in theory not ever opening a direct line from the magazine to the lower hoist mechanisms, a bit like the old safety deposit hatches in banks. Now, although doors from the magazines into the passages where the scuttles were, and in some cases through the scuttle-equipped bulkheads into the lower hoist areas, were still included in most designs, and could be used for much more direct passage of charges, since the transition to completely using scuttles was somewhat gradual, you could find some ships in the World War I era which still relied simply on airlock-style doors to pass charges, and these could of course be propped open in the interests of facilitating faster passage. However the charge arrived at the lower part of the hoist, it would then ascend, whether in its case or not, depending on the precise practice in a given navy, but most often not, as at the other end of this procedure there was usually direct loading into a gun, and the gunhouse crew had better things to do than unpack all the charges. Anyway, on its way up, it would usually pass through at least one, or more normally a series of spring-loaded hatches, or plates, which were designed to offer further physical barriers to fire, flash, and even debris. Although in some cases, these were less seals and more just a mild form of mitigation. At the upper end of the turret hoist mechanism, the charge could then have one of two things happen. In ships of the earlier part of the 20th century, it wasn't uncommon to have a working chamber directly beneath the gunhouse. This afforded another break in the potential chain of fire and explosions. It reduced the amount of heavy machinery that needed to be positioned in the often cramped turrets, and in some ships, it even allowed for charges and shells coming up from below to be split to feed to the various guns, as in some vessels, particularly some of the early American standards, the long hoists only brought up 2 sets of ammunition, as they were the same system that had been used on ships that exclusively used twin turrets. But they needed to feed 3 guns in a new triple turret, and so you could divide them up into 3 separate feeds for the 3 separate short hoists. But in any case, the ammo would be placed on shorter hoists, whether that was 1, 2, or 3, where they would then be taken up just the one level into the gunhouse, where the shell and then the charges would be loaded into the gun and the gun fired. In some cases, additional shells could or were stored in either the working chamber, the gunhouse, or both, usually in an effort to try and increase shell capacity, and sometimes in an effort to also increase the rate of fire. If this was the case, then auxiliary machinery or man-powered chainfalls would be needed to move the heavy shells into the semi-automated loading system. Naturally, where you had additional shells, there was also the temptation to store additional charges, partially because of the belief in their relative inertness of the explosive, especially when they were still confined to their cases, and partially because, well, in the 1900s and 1910s, there was also a belief that in the new era of long-range gunfire, i.e. gunfire over about 1,500 yards, the first few salvos, even if you had modern fire control systems, probably weren't going to hit anything anyway, but they were vital to getting the true range by assessing by how badly you'd missed, and therefore it was best to chuck those early salvos downrange as quickly as possible to get as much data as possible to establish the true range as quickly as possible so you could actually start hitting your opponent. And so the logic went that any ammunition stored in these more vulnerable locations would surely be expended very rapidly, establishing the range, long before there was any risk of being hit as the enemy did the same and began to zero in on your location. Another dangerous development was the habit of preloading the hoist system even if charges weren't stored in other areas that they weren't supposed to be. It was found in some ships on various navies that when they were going into action, the crews would load the guns, but then they'd have another set of shells and charges ready to be slid over onto the loading tray in the gunhouse, with another set loaded in the working chamber hoists, another set on the working chamber trays, another set at the top of the main hoists, and still more if the hoists happen to be an endless chain system with multiple cages on them, and still more sets of charges and shells ready to be loaded at the bottom of the hoists in either case. Even assuming that flash mitigation measures were still fully in place, this chain of propellant would easily overload a system that was never designed to deal with this kind of situation. A final hazard of this early era, which essentially was the 1890s through to the mid to late 1910s, was the unforeseen chemical decay of the new propellants. Now, granted, gunpowder can also slowly decay if it's exposed to water, but generally speaking, decayed gunpowder is actually less effective, not more. In very rare cases, clumped powder could be a little bit more sensitive to being set off through friction if you tried to break up the clumps, but it was still a pretty stable explosive. And if you just kept your powder dry and relatively temperature controlled, black powder could last for decades, if not more. The more modern explosives, however, needed chemical stabilizers and were quite temperature sensitive, especially the early formulations. Over time, the stabilizers ended up being used up by the ongoing chemical reactions and would then either break down or they would interact with the propellant in very interesting ways. This could lead to problems in one of 2 major ways. Direct decomposition, making the propellant overly sensitive and unstable. This appears to have happened with French poudre B. Some early 20th century US Navy propellants, you'd be surprised just how many small explosions and fires there were in US magazines at that period, and possibly some of the Royal Navy's cordite as well. This kind of direct decomposition could lead to spontaneous detonation of a propellant charge for almost no reason whatsoever, or something just as mundane as the case was jostled slightly. This issue plagued the Marine Nationale most of all, and the temperature sensitivity of this issue, as higher temperatures accelerated the decomposition, was borne out when you look and realise that most of the problems that were experienced by the Marine Nationale ships spontaneously blowing up were for ships based in the Mediterranean at Toulon, which is considerably warmer than the much colder Atlantic and Channel ports, where the issue was not necessarily completely unheard of, but much rarer. The other problem was the one that was more closely identified with the Royal Navy in the early formulations of its cordite. And this was the breakdown causing the charge to sweat, in inverted commas, nitroglycerin, which was then suspended or mixed with other components, either of the explosive or also including things like silk threads from the bags that it had just passed through, bits of the stabilizer, and the dust of the floor it might eventually fall on. This could then leave a trail of very flammable and fractionally more stable, but still extremely sensitive explosive residue pretty much anywhere that an uncovered charge happened to be transported. And even if strict cleanliness standards were followed, which pre-Jutland aboard HMS Lion it was found they weren't, and there was just a lot of very, very flammable dust everywhere, the movement of many charges, like, I don't know, say if you're feeding a bunch of charges up to the turret in a battle because they're all being expended, could re-establish that trail pretty quickly if the charges in their cases had already sweated out this nitroglycerin mixed crystal form. This, in turn, was one of several reasons why the Royal Navy would go through a number of different formulations for cordite over the first 2 decades of the 20th century, eventually ending up with a far more stable iteration worked out, albeit that cordite was far from the most stable of World War I, World War II era propellants. And so you entered World War II with the final iteration of Battleship Magazines safety, the charges all in their cases, the charges then being fed through scuttles, then being placed onto powder hoists, which went through several anti-flash doors to reach a gun house, where they were quickly loaded and sent on their way, and the charges themselves being made up of considerably more improved and more stable propellant compared to that which might have been around in the 1900s and 1910s. Even then, there were still variations between navies. Some propellant, like Royal Navy cordite, was a bit more energetic, but could also be ignited by a strong heat source that was a small distance away, a couple of feet. Whereas some of the more stable propellants, like those used by the US Navy, needed you to be within a handful of inches with the same heat source before they'd spontaneously ignite of their own accord. Of course, once you actually ignited a charge, all bets were off, because then it was going to get very violent and very hot very quickly. But the differences in sensitivity could still have some effect as to whether a chain reaction got going or not, even once a few charges went off. One final note when it comes to magazine safety in the late 19th and early 20th century, of course, is the location of the propellant magazines. We previously mentioned that they would initially be at the lowest part of the ship, below the shells, to keep them away from gunfire that was coming in up top. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was new concern over the development of torpedoes and mines, and a fear that that low-down position suddenly made them very vulnerable to being set off by underwater explosions. And so in some ships, the magazine position with the shell room was reversed, with the shells now stored deep down and acting as a sort of protective barrier against the final effects of underwater explosions, and then the propellant atop them. And that was purely just to keep the propellant from those underwater dangers, although it did mean you then had to trust even more in your armoured deck to keep incoming shell fire away from your main magazine and stopping you from just going boom. But that's a quick overview of the main elements in the development of magazine safety, and thus hopefully how not to explode while you're being a capital ship in the age of steam, steel, and guns. And the age of sail and the age of gunpowder as well, I suppose. And of course, don't forget the holiday convoy event we mentioned at the beginning of the video with World of Warships. There's the bonus code on screen for you once again. Links in the description and pinned post. Thanks for watching.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.